You've been listening there to the French President Emmanuel Macron, who's currently in Cyprus. In fact, he was there speaking at an airbase in Paphos. Before I ask my international affairs editor, Kethevane Gorjestani, a question in regards to that press conference, I just want to bring people up to speed in regards to what's happened in the last couple of hours, with Turkey announcing that NATO air defences shot down a second ballistic missile that was fired from Iran and had entered Turkish airspace. Ankara warning that it will take any necessary steps against threats. So against that background, Kethevane, let's talk about what the French president has just been saying. A reminder to viewers, dare I say, that the drone attack wasn't necessarily on Cypriot soil, but on a British RAF base at Akateri on the southern coast of Cyprus. But it is very interesting that it is the French and the European Union that's really come forward and said we are now seeing this as an attack on Cyprus being an attack on the whole of the EU.
Yes, and that was pretty much the closing argument of the French president. At the end, he talked about how this was once again proof of the necessity and the importance of Europe's strategic independence, and the fact that it was the EU member states like the French, like the Greeks, like the Italians, the Spaniards, who are also accompanying the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean around Cyprus. They are the ones currently assuming that protection of this area, and not only of Cyprus, but of some of the partners in the region. So that was clearly, without necessarily mentioning it, but it was a way of insisting on how important and what role the Europeans can play in a conflict that they didn't choose, that they were not consulted on, but that they had to get into in a way. However, Emmanuel Macron was very, very adamant throughout his comments to talk about, one, yes, the solidarity of EU member states amongst each other, because there is the equivalent of NATO's Article 5. The attack on one is an attack on all. There is a similar process for the Europeans. And as you said, there was that line that Emmanuel Macron said, when Cyprus is attacked, it's all of Europe that is attacked. But he also took great pains to insist, and I think he used the word many, many times, defensive. This is all about defense, Emmanuel Macron says, defending our citizens in the region, defending an EU member state, defending our partners, because France, like other European states, has security partnerships with several countries, especially in the Gulf, that are currently being attacked. Why is he insisting on the defensive aspect of the French military posture? Because he does not want France to get dragged into a war. And there was this call between Emmanuel Macron and the Iranian president yesterday, Masoud Pezeshkian, where Emmanuel Macron spoke to the Iranian president, and the Iranian president's comment were these: any action, be it offensive or defensive, aimed at supporting the aggressors of Iran will be considered participation in the war. What Emmanuel Macron and other Europeans are trying to make very clear is that they will only respond if there is an attack on their interests, that they are not wanting to be part of the offensive war of Israel and the U.S., and that was very clear. One example of last week, this sort of scaffou of information between the Americans and the French, the Americans hinting that France had given authorization to use its military bases in the region. Not so, said the French army. You can use our French base to refuel, for example. We are not giving you permission to use our bases as a launch pad for strikes on Iran, making it very clear that they will defend themselves, but they don't want to be part of this war directly.
Indeed, and as you say, their defence is obviously the operative word in all of this, but it's clearly a strategy by the Iranians to do whatever they can to drag other countries in the region into this ever-widening conflict. What other initiatives did he talk about there in that speech? Because he did mention that there would be meetings of European leaders in the days ahead. I mean, clearly they're all trying to come together and show a unified force as such.
Absolutely, because the other main word in these comments was a de-escalation. There was defense and de-escalation, because one thing that the Europeans definitely do not want to see is this escalation. They don't want to give a reason to the Iranians to drag them further into this war, because they're already seeing the impacts that are spilling over, whether it's militarily with those drone attacks on different countries in the region. And you were just mentioning even the airspace of Turkey being targeted, Turkey, a NATO member. So all of this is spilling over, growing and growing. And you have these countries that are saying, look, we have not responded so far, but if you keep striking us, we will respond. That was the case of some of the Gulf countries who were very harsh towards Iran, saying, stop targeting us. We are not part of this war, if you will. There's also, of course, the question of the economic spillover. And part of what Emmanuel Macron was talking about the security of the Red Sea, the security of the Strait of Hormuz. All of that is because oil prices have been skyrocketing around the world. And you're already seeing the consequences at the gas pump for Europeans, for Americans all across the world. And he did mention that there was a G7 finance members meeting. They're also considering tapping into the strategic oil reserves around the world to try to keep those prices at a minimum increase, if you will, because they know they're not going to be able to hold on to all of this. But this just gives you an idea of how this conflict is not only spilling over borders, but spilling over in just not being military only, but also having geopolitical and economic impacts. And that's what some of the Europeans are trying the way they can to try to influence.